Welcome back, listeners. This is Freddie Laker, your host for the O Ship Show, where we dive deep into the stories of today's leaders and innovators. Today, we're not just exploring new horizons, we're taking leaps, big leaps. This episode is about daring greatly, summoning the courage, and equipping ourselves with the knowledge to jump farther in our careers than we ever thought possible. To guide us on this journey, I'm thrilled to introduce you to our guest, Shailene Simmons. She's the CEO of LogicMark, a leading company in the personal safety and security technology space, and an inspirational figure who has consistently made those big leaps in her own career. From startups to Fortune 50 companies, she has been at the forefront of industries such as AI, IoT, healthcare, and e commerce, always pushing the boundaries and turning possibilities into realities. Beyond her executive role, Shailene is an influential player in the world of tech investments, championing female founders and nurturing the next generation of innovators. Her experience and insight make her a formidable guest, and I can't wait for all of us to learn from her wisdom. So, whether you're on the edge of your own big leap or seeking inspiration for the journey ahead, you're in the right place. It's about courage, it's about knowledge, and it's about making the jump. Are you ready to get inspired and empowered? This is the O Ship Show. Let's get started.
Oh shit.
Welcome to a ship. How are you today?
Doing great, thank you.
Definitely looking forward to picking your brain. I hope I was a suitable hype man for your very cool background.
Thank you so much for the great hype. I'm gonna have to hire you to go out and
I'd love to start just a little bit of background for anyone who's listening. I talked a little bit about you and your business, but could you give us a quick intro on LogicMark and what your focus is these days?
Sure. LogicMark is in what we call the personal emergency response system, which is quite a bit of a mouthful of words. But basically, we're in what I used to call the help I can't get up business. And so the medical alerts business, which is a little bit crazy. But in many ways, that's what's actually making it exciting to be here. It's an industry that's been around for quite a while. So for a lot of us who've seen those late night ads with the lady who's fallen and can't get up, the technology hadn't really changed very much in the industry since those times. And it just was not what a tech person typically would go into. And certainly I came out of AI in my previous job. So boy, what am I doing in a old school medical alarms business? But it's actually exactly why I'm in this business, which is LogicMark is trying to transform how we look at what it means to have health communications products and medical alerts and personal emergency response systems for everybody that's involved in the caring of an elderly person or somebody that they love of any age. So,
We alluded to this idea in today's episode about taking big leaps. And I get this impression that you've made quite a few big leaps across your career, especially across all these different industries you've made. Now at the helm of not only a new business, but a publicly traded one as well. You've had quite a journey. Before we dig deep into some of the thinking behind how do you make big leaps, how do you approach them, how do you learn from them, what does a big leap actually mean to you?
yeah, I think when people think about making big leaps, often we put it in a context of doing it blindly, right? The only way that you can do it is don't think about it and just do it and make that flying leap into a number of things. Decisions are about a career, where we go, all of those things. And certainly think I'm a believer in basically making as informed of risk as decision as possible and analysis as possible before you make the big leap. But there's always going to be an element of uncertainty and whether or not it's a balance of what you're able to really decipher and hedge for before you take that leap is the sort of key to making big decisions. And so it becomes a big leap, but it's not one that's ill informed and you're not taking that leap without some type of flotation device, which is appropriate for the show, or a parachute. So I have to have
I
some
do
nature.
love a good nautical pun, but I'm not going to lie.
Exactly.
One last question for context. I think when you talk about a leap, that's in essence jumping from one place to another. Where did your career start? So we've got a reference point for, I think, how many of these kind of leaps that we're going to talk about today.
Sure. So I was a communications major of all things as an undergrad, and so not necessarily what one would think would be somebody who plays in a sort of technology industry sector. And so I literally left college thinking I was going to do one or two things, which I thought I was going to be working in a publishing industry, helping to put out as many like great novels as possible or magazines. And so that seemed like a great sort of idea. But what I'd actually studied in school, ironically, was the beginnings of the internet. And I kept thinking, like, that thing is so cool. Like, I really need to find out more about it. And I kept being intrigued and being intrigued about it, and ended up going to a publishing course of all things at Harvard. And at the time when everybody was talking about books and magazines, there was one guy hanging out there, and his name is John Patel. And I was intrigued, and it turns
The
out that
John Wired, right?
from Wired.
Yeah, yeah,
So,
yeah,
they were still putting out the magazine back then, and
yeah.
so you spent a lot of time talking to him about this sort of really cool thing called HTMI and websites and so forth, and we're doing that type of thing, and so keep in touch with me, and it's planted a seed in my head. Then I have been very intrigued by it in 1993 when I first saw the mosaics browser, and I thought, "I don't know what that is, but I gotta do something there. That seems to be very intriguing." So I hacked together some random webpage for the local Little Caesars under the table money and in cash, and thought, "Yeah, this seems easy to do this HTML, like, website business. I'm going to go into publishing, publish the great novels, right, of the world or magazines that people enjoy." But leaving that, I still thought, "Boy, this internet thing is really intriguing." So ended up taking that leap, that first leap and going to internet company, which, by the way, was not the best idea according to my parents, because at the time I had a job offer to go to Disney's publishing program, licensing program, and it was to basically license all their characters for golden books and all that type of thing, and you couldn't get a much cooler publishing job than.
Yeah, yeah.
And I told my parents, "No, I'm not gonna do this great job at Disney and go to LA, but I'm gonna go to New York and take this job at an internet company." And my parents turned around and said, "What the hell is this internet thing?" Right? Hard to believe because in 1995, that was still a very new thing. Having a URL at the bottom of a movie poster was
Yeah.
very cutting edge, right? And so my parents did not understand it, and I'm not entirely sure that I fully comprehended everything, but I postulated how that could change things. Everybody had a computer. That sort of trajectory of that sort of demographic was growing of people who own computers. Websites at the time, you could still find them
Mm.
using Yahoo with people indexing.
I remember when Yahoo was basically a directory.
Yes.
Make sure you're like, "I got a number in the front of my company. I've nailed this
Exactly.
yet."
I fundamentally believe that, like, technology is exponential, and that's what I learned in school, and so the big leap was whether or not this particular industry, which we've seen mind-staggering sort of exponential growth, was going to take this thing that was probably going to radically change publishing, right? And so that was the leap, was that when I looked at the data of what seemed to be an entirely different industry, which is the technology and computer or personal computers industry, and said, when you look at the extrapolation of that, this could be appropriately applied here, and you can forecast that this is a possibility. Now, all of this is somewhat rational, but was it rational in 1995? I think that my parents thought I was making a fairly irrational sort of postulation of sort of what could be, right? And so they're like, "Yeah, those are two different things, books and Disney and Mickey versus this internet thing, and we don't even know what that means, this website business and internet. You're not selling computers. It's one thing if you were selling a personal computer like an IBM, for example, that's very exciting, but none of that was. But that big leap was based on what I was capable of finding at the time and making as informed an analysis as I could before I was jumping.
When you think about big leaps, there's different reasons that people do them, right? So sometimes I think people have to make big career leaps because maybe they're boxed into a corner and they've got to do things that maybe look a little crazy sometimes because it's born out of necessity. And I think what you and I are talking about today, though, is seeing opportunities for big leaps, either because you love something and you're driven by a passion for it. And maybe it's not a rational thing, but it's like, that this is a deep aspiration. And then other times, I think there's things that are really strategic career growth where you're like, I'm here and I know I want to get here. And how do I get to that next place and this vision of future that you've envisioned for yourself? And so I'd love to understand, as you've made quite a few of these big leaps across your career, what's the most valuable lessons you've picked up along the way?
Yeah, I think that one of the big things I've learned along the way is that when you're making big decisions, it's always very personal, but it's really helpful to basically get feedback from people. And even if the feedback is that you shouldn't make the leap, or it should be, to gathering that information and hearing all of the different reasons, yes or no, is extremely helpful in terms of making that leap. When I took this particular role at LogicMark, I literally went out to every C-level executive, women, men that I knew, and there was all varying ways of giving you feedback as to yes or no of taking something.
Mhm,
And so the reasoning, whether or not you agree with it or not, is very informative in terms of helping to discern whether or not it's a good decision or not.
mm,
I'm a big believer in doing sort of data analysis on things that seem they are not exactly on point, but is correlated and has areas of movement. For example, that discussion around going into this internet business versus
mm,
saw the Disney job and having those items really in place so that when you're making that big leap, it is true when people talk about that, it's passion and leap of faith and all of those. I'm a believer in being as informed as you could so that it's a little bit less of a shock when you dive overboard. And I am going to use
mm.
all of those ship references, dive overboard.
You're on a roll. I'm not
You
going to
know it,
stop you.
but at least you're somewhat prepared, right?
When I hear about kind of your approach and you're getting really prepared, you're getting really informed, whether you're doing it consciously for the reason I'm about to say or not is TBD, but things like that. So most people will say, hey, take a big leap is nerve wracking. It makes people a little scared. And you could argue the more you know, the more confident you are in those big leaps.
Mhm.
And so I guess my question is twofold. When you make these big leaps, do you get scared at all? And if you've got other people out there, then maybe you don't get nervous about that. And that's we've all got different kind of DNA about this. But other people, if they are scared of big leaps, what advice would you give them?
Sure. Okay. So actually, ironically, the more you look at it and the more you dig, sometimes the more scared you get, right?
That's true.
About the problem. And so versus just jumping in without really enough data and you're taking it on faith. And so sometimes actually digging in more gives you more nervousness, bigger fear. The question always becomes, are these fears rational, or are these fears are things that, is part of this big decision, things that you can rationalize and potentially fix, and you know that it is part of the big challenge and it's something that's things that are you can remedy at the end of the day.
Mm,
And the reality is that it is always going to be a situation where I think that for a business person, it's irrational to not be fearful when you jump into a big sort of
mm.
situation because typically most people are armed with a lot of information in the world that we live in. And so there is, as much as I talk about arming yourself, there's always an element of risk and there's always an element of unknown and always an element of fear. And it's just a pushing through to sort of get to the other side because ultimately, whatever decision you make about a big leap, you're doing it because there's a passion. And you mentioned
Mhm,
passion at the beginning, and
mhm.
everything has to be backed by passion. I could be as rational as possible about going to the internet or starting at LogicMark, but I was calculated. I felt like I did as much research as I could about the LogicMark job. But what drove me too was that I had to have a passion for believing that there's a real need for a transformation in the industry. And that's a passion for helping people like my mother in law and for all the people I knew with elderly loved ones, and that they needed somebody to be their champion.
1,000% aligned on kind of the driving force of passion. It's certainly something that I've cared about and it's driven a lot of what I think about. There's also, I think, this danger in over planning sometimes. I know a lot of people in their career who I see them I'm not I don't think this is what you're doing, to be clear, but I see a lot of people sometimes so obsessively focus on what these next big leaps are, and they put so many dimensions and criteria and boundaries, and they try and visualize it so hard that whatever they achieve, when it doesn't feel like this thing that they've built in their imagination, which is never really aligned to reality, that it gives them this weird sense of failure. So I think that's one cautionary tale, I think, in this is, for me, I would say to people, I love this idea of making big leaps and having the courage to do this. Very kind of entrepreneurial trait, frankly.
Yeah.
Also giving yourself the freedom and the flexibility to let it evolve a little bit. When I think in my own big leaps I've done in my career, some of the best things I did were I'd been mulling them over, but when the moment it got to make the leap, I was quite impulsive about it, saying, "Hey, I'm going to start another business," quitting a job and starting a company a couple of days later, and saying, "I'll figure it out as I go along." So one of the things I think we just addressed was talking about how do you prep for the big leap, okay? But what about the other side of it? After you've made the big leap and you're now potentially into your next role, you may even be thinking about what the next big leap after that is, depending on how much of a chess player you are. How do you maintain your momentum after a big leap?
After the initial "oh shit" moment, because you've made your leap and honestly, you're thinking, "What the heck did I get myself into here?" It is often some strategic, sort of real thought through and planning. It's interesting because I don't actually plan my next leaps to a certain extent, right? I always tell people, like, what I would call like human centric
Mhm,
executive. And so, what I'm really typically looking at for the next leap after I'm hopefully fixed up or
mhm,
launch whatever I was launching is that I'm looking for problems to solve.
mm,
And so I'm also not trying to look for problems to solve now. Not that I think Wayne Gretzky is the philosopher of all times, but he said something that always stuck with me that I somewhat live by, which is he's trying to, and I not verbatim here, but he's not skating to where the puck is, but he's skating to where the puck is going to be.
mm,
So I try to give myself time every week to think about what the future is and what are issues of the world and what are the things that I really care about and what are the things that people care about and where are things going. And I think about what the next problem is going to be, not the existing problem, but what is the next problem going to be that people are going to run into.
mm.
And that's where I try to skate to.
Yeah, it's funny. I hadn't thought about this before this show. I think when you start thinking about taking sequential links in events, that feels a bit like ladder climbing to me, corporate ladder climbing, where I think what you and I are really talking about, and especially when passion is such a big part of it, is saying, I see this new thing on the horizon, and I'm doing it because I'm excited about it. Yes, it may help me find a new challenge, which is frequently intertwined with career growth, but seeking out problems, seeking out things where you can add value. And I think living in the moment a little bit to identify those and not trying to think this two, three things out. There's a saying in the startup world, which I'm sure you're familiar with. It's like a solution in search of a problem kind of thing. And I think people maybe start trying to figure out things in advance as if you take a moment to just see the things unfold in front of you. I think these kind of great opportunities and these leaps may present themselves. I think then it becomes about how people take them.
Absolutely.
Um, One of the things you said that really caught my eye is there's this very human element to how you're so tuned into what's happening around you, and I love that. In your role as a CEO, and even just more maybe even specifically around LogicMark, how important is emotional intelligence in that line of work?
We are in a business of helping people help their family members at a very vulnerable moment. And absolutely being emotionally intelligent is a key component of what we do every day. The reality is that we have to put ourselves into the shoes of an elderly person or the caretaker of an elderly person. And so if we're not there from an emotional intelligence level of advocating for our customers, and that's every team member from finance to product to some customer support to marketing, then we're not doing our jobs right. And cultivating that emotional intelligence, visually allows us to also be able to utilize that in a workplace with each other and giving us ourselves the benefit of the doubt to get things done. We are at LogicMark a startup with a ticker symbol. And so we're really a tiny micro cap company. And when people talk about families, and in the classic sense of like tech industries, when they talk about being part of a family, in the past, it's always, we're gonna hang out and be cool and drink beer on Thursdays in our all hands. Or you could think of this as a, do we have the emotional intelligence as a team to say, look, this person has a problem with their parent right now, and so we need to be emotionally supportive as they may take a 150% type of person, maybe stepping down to an 80%
Mhm.
leadership role or
Mhm.
70%, and having the emotional intelligence to say, like, how do we rally around this individual and still get what we want to get done? Because at the end of the day, we have shareholder and we have customers who rely on us to be at the best of what we do.
Yeah, I want to explore more around your leadership style. There's patterns of evolving that I think could lead to some really interesting questions for you. See, emotional intelligence obviously plays a big part in how you approach customers, how you approach employees. Just it seems to be really core into what you do. You then parallel that with, I think, the fact that you've taken more big leaps in your career than I think a lot of the kind of some of the folks, some more traditional folks I end up speaking to. So when you combine those two things, I'd love to understand how has that impacted how you operate as a leader?
Well, so I like to think that having emotional intelligence coupled with really strong analytical like focus, right side, left side of the brain has helped me be much more successful in the leaps than perhaps people are capable of doing, because there's calculating analysis, which is you and I talked about just now, the climbing the ladder and making the big leaps that way. But yeah, no, I think it has helped me think about the type of leader I want to be, and also how to be adaptive. And I think this is the more sort of analytical part of it, which is how do you be able to pivot your leadership style to fit the need of an individual versus the overall organization. And when you talk to people who spend a lot of time talking about leaderships, they can be very academic about it. And people will say things like, oh, I'm a servant leader, I'm this and I'm that. And so when people ask me that question about what is your leadership style, I tell them it depends. It depends
Mm.
on what the situation is, what do I need to be, and where's sort of like the organization going at any one time. And I may want to practice servant leadership all the time. Certain element of time, perhaps command and control would be the right thing to deal with, right? But perhaps it's the emotional intelligence of being able to say, look, you have to be adaptive depending on what the situation is and who the individual is and who adapts best to what.
I'm trying to decide if this is your really nice way of saying this is how you decide between sugar or stick. It's
Uh,
like,
and I think there's some element of that for sure. Look, I'm a firm believer in that people are wanting to be their best and do their best. And maybe that's naive, but I think that most people want to be the best of what they do. They want to be kind to other people. I tend to want to give people that sort of more rosy sort of piece of it. And so when you think about things like behavioral economics, if you just put the right conditions in front of people, then they're going to go for the best sort of solution. But this is not always the case. People act as irrational actors within an environment. And so sometimes that stick just comes out because you
yeah,
have to.
got it. Sometimes sadly got to be there, but I love how I think you think about this. I've been dying to ask this question for at least 15 minutes, but I like to save it for the latter half of the show. It would not be O Ship if I didn't ask you for an O Ship question. I get the impression that you've navigated quite a few ups and downs over the years through your various roles. For those of you who are joining O Ship for the first time, a little bit of background on this. One of the things we like to do on the show is get a chance to talk to people that are incredible leaders, incredible entrepreneurs, just experienced people who've been around the block and say, tell us about a moment where your plan basically went to hell and imploded on you. Maybe it was a big leap, maybe it was just everyday business. And maybe you even failed completely and didn't recover from it, but I like to see how people deal with adversity, whether they solved it or didn't solve it. I think how people deal with those ship moments is a great reference to character, but it's also, frankly, something that's super useful to all of us because life is not always easy. So, with that, Shailene, I would love to hear your O ship story. The floor is yours.
Oh boy, so many to pick from. I think that we all face so many oh shit moments. Look, I'll bring one that's probably the most relevant and most recent, right? Look, as I mentioned, this particular opportunity came out of nowhere. I was in the midst of leaving my previous company, which was an AI company for retail. And I was thinking about what I wanted to do next and giving myself a little bit of breathing room. So this opportunity came, and the recruiter is just as nice as can be and super smart guy. And he came in and said, look, here's this company that's in the midst of a pivot. They're letting go their CEO. And oh, by the way, there's two lawsuits, and we will probably need to reverse stock split the company. So are you in? Isn't this exciting?
No pressure.
No pressure. Isn't this, wonderful career opportunity? And of course, I did all of my sort of calculated, talked to everybody, did my analysis work, and I call it the three-legged stool of success, right? You got the right people, the right product, and the timing has to be right demographically. So I did all of my analysis and said, it's still a leap of faith because my goodness, right? It's a potential delisting, two lawsuits. They probably need to raise a little money. And boy, like they fired like their previous CEO. Leap of faith, let's do it. Landed there and went, oh shit, this is much, much worse than I thought. If that wasn't bad enough, like there was just a number of other issues, a company that hasn't launched a product in 15 years, like since 2015. Things are always worse, right? Because when you're dating, like everybody puts their best foot forward. And if this was a dating situation, this guy already looks a little squirrely, but I'm just taking
They're hiding the really bad stuff. Yeah.
exactly. So he's already revealed so much ugly, and so you leave and it's like, oh man, it's even worse. Oh shit. But the passion of saying, do I fundamentally believe there needs to be something really amazing out there? And do I really believe that for people like my mother-in-law and everybody out there that really need something that is going to make them safer? And for people like me who is spending a lot of time helping people who they love. So you take that oh shit moment and you go, okay, how do I break it down? How do I break it down into something that just wasn't like a tsunami coming over you and it's overwhelming because trying to paddle a ship away from a tsunami is next to impossible. So now you're thinking like, what are the ways I could survive the next 5 minutes to 10
Mhm.
minutes to 15 minutes? And you slowly bail yourself out of a scenario as best as to get to rising to the surface of something.
I keep feeling this common theme coming through around just like when you have a passion for something, that it's worth it. It's worth the making the energy to make a big leap. It's worth dealing with the adversity and whatever stress and challenges that may come along with that. And maybe that's like one of the key messages of today's episode is if you care about it enough and you're adding enough value and you feel like you're making an impact, a lot of these things that feel like they're very daunting for people, whether that's the anxiety of making the big leap, the preparation that you may have to invest, time, sometimes even money, it's worth it. And I'll let you deal with the harder side on the other side of the leap as well, because people think the big leap's about the jump. It's just as much about landing it and staying upright afterwards.
Like there's going to be tons of lifeboats and which ones to abandon and which ones
Yeah.
not to,
You're good. Just keep bringing it on. Just those
man,
nautical ones.
a
So good.
nautical theme is here. But it's very appropriate, right? Because when you talk about taking a big leap, it is a lot of that fear of drowning and people's fear that they're not going to survive a big leap. And so everything was going to be falling apart. And the reality is that we're much more capable as individuals than we really give ourselves credit for. So few people give themselves credit for the ability just to take the next breath and survive and then move on to take the next step, right? Because
Mhm.
everything seems when you take a big leap to be an overwhelming amount of data, issues, and so forth. And because there's so much onslaught. that it's often really difficult to make analytical decisions because you're taking a leap on an emotional level to a certain degree because
Mhm.
that's usually the final push. You can
Mhm.
do all your analysis, but the final push is about passion and whether or not you're gonna,
True.
but then that overwhelming sense of, "Boy, did I really screw this
Mm,
one up." Exactly the "oh shit" moment, and it's what's gonna bail you out typically is that idea of breaking things down into, like,
mm,
manageable sort of pieces so that you can get to the other side, and let's be honest, right? The landing, you think that you're gonna be done in 6 months, and
mm.
sometimes it's like contracting for a house, right? I'm building a new house. So they say 6 months, but now it's a year and a half later, but the end is going to be in sight. It just sometimes takes a little bit longer and it's a little bit harder of a challenge, but if you think it's worth it and the passion is there, and let's be honest that there's a problem to solve, and I think that's what drives a lot of people to do what they do, that there's a problem to solve and people to help, then it's worth it.
I couldn't agree more. But I only have one criticism, and I hope you don't take offense to me criticizing you on the air. It's that you were so good this whole episode, and then all of a sudden you talked about building a house when it could have been building a boat, and you just dropped the ball right at the end there. Look at that. Just
I mixed
I,
my metaphors. I was so on
you
theme.
you were close to perfection.
I will think about more shipbuilding metaphors. I think
Perfect.
there's
So I got one last question for you. I really enjoyed this interview, by the way. So thank you again for joining me. When you look back at your whole career, and maybe it could be for pre first job, I don't know, but in retrospect, has there ever been maybe a leap that you wish you had taken sooner? And hindsight's always 2020. Is there anything out there that kind of wish you'd done differently?
Yeah, no, I absolutely do. I didn't become a first-time entrepreneur until my 40s, actually. And so I had imposter syndrome, like I think a lot of us out there,
Mm,
right? I was thinking, like, who am I to think that I can go and raise money? Am I ready? Do I have all the tools in my toolkit to make this happen? And like that guy who started the company, he must know more and have done
mm.
more. And it didn't take me until my 40s to make that leap. And I do have that hindsight of 2020 of I wish I'd done that earlier in my career. And mainly because I think that learning, and I wouldn't say that my startup was a tremendous success. And
Doesn't matter. That's not the point, I
that's
think,
not
with
the
us being
point.
an entrepreneur. Yeah.
Exactly. But the learning would have made me a much better employee somewhere else. It
Mm.
brought great insights into a number of things, and it brought a great amount of insights to me about myself as a leader, as an employee, as a person who works in the tech industry, as a human being. And so I wish I'd taken that sort of leap a little bit earlier.
I love that. Thank you for sharing that. Very, very honest retrospective. Was you may have started a little later, but you're a very impressive entrepreneur, and I'm thrilled to have had you on today. For any of the guests who may be watching, whether they're tuning in through our audio podcasts or watching on any of the video streams, what's the best way that they can reach you or catch up with you or learn more about you?
Sure, I used to tell people Twitter, but now I don't know what to call it.
I feel you on that one.
So you can always find me on LinkedIn, which is LinkedIn/in/C Simmons, CSIMONS, or you can find me at LogicMark. Please reach out.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And all of you out there, thank you again for watching. The best thing you can do to support the show is like this episode, comment on it, tag it, share it on your social feeds. If you're interested in finding more ways to tune in, go to oshipshow.com and you will see all the different ways you can watch the show. As I mentioned on some recent episodes, we're many thousands of YouTube subscribers now, and across, I think we're just about 15,000 podcast subscribers now. So the show's really growing, and that's thanks to all of you. So thank you, thank you, thank you. Shailene, great getting to hang out with you again. A really great story, and I hope we stay in contact because you're really fascinating. So everyone, we'll see you next week on O Ship.
Thank you.